Hi, everyone. We've been looking at different social contract thinkers, Hobbes and then Locke, both from the 17th century. We're moving on now, on into the 18th century, and what's sometimes called the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment, a great flowering of learning and rational learned debate and deliberation. And this reasoned deliberation was happening in almost every big metropolitan center in Western Europe, and it took place in universities and learned societies, but also in salons and coffee shops. And these places constituted what's sometimes called the public sphere, a space or set of spaces where individuals can come and freely discuss matters of public concern and arrive at something like public opinion, trying to persuade each other through reason and evidence. And the figure who we're going to be talking about today is, in a way, part of this whole movement. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in Geneva, French-speaking Switzerland, in 1712, and he's famous for his works of political philosophy. The discourse on the arts and sciences, the discourse on inequality, and a book simply called The Social Contract. And we're going to be trying to look at a little bit of all three of these works. Rousseau was part of the Enlightenment, but in many ways he reacted against it. He was part of the culture of Enlightenment. He was good friends with a great many of the philosophers of his own day in his adopted country and elsewhere. He knew Diderot and Voltaire and David Hume. But he always ended up falling out with them, having these massive bust-ups. He was a man of peculiar sensitivities. He had what is now properly called a persecution complex. He was convinced that everyone was plotting against him. And we know all this because he wrote a very full and explicit tell-all autobiography called The Confessions, which was perhaps the first modern autobiography as we now understand the genre. And it's very confessional. We're on, I think, page 6 before he starts telling us how much he loves being spanked and how he could never find a lady willing to do it for him. And there's some even more shameful episodes in the book than that. Rousseau had 6 children over the course of his life, and he gave them all away. He sent them all to the Foundling Hospital, which was an orphanage, and he never saw them again. So Rousseau was morally bankrupt and deeply nuts and a bit kinky. But he was also a beautiful writer. I think of all the writers that we're looking at on this course, he's the one most reading for, for his own sake, for just the experience of reading him. So he was part of the Enlightenment culture, but he actually rejected the whole notion that was at the core of the Enlightenment, which was that of rational progress. He rejected reason. He thought it was a poor substitute for natural inclination and instinctive compassion and sentiment. And he saw the supposed progress and advance of civilization that the Enlightenment heralded as really a regression and a corruption of mankind. And since the dawn of civilization, he believed, things had mostly been getting worse. The idea that everyone associates with Rousseau is that of the noble savage, though he never actually used the phrase. It's a common mistake, but he never actually said it. You might have heard this phrase, the noble savage, before. A savage is a man in his natural state, a man without civilization. And it referred to the kind of people that Europeans had been meeting in the Americas and the Caribbean and in Africa through the process of colonizing and enslaving them. And the dominant and most prevalent idea about these people was that they were barbarous and violent and thuggish and lacking in good morals and reason. And Rousseau takes this idea and he flips it, he inverts it. He believed that instead of this supposed state of savagery, stateless people without civilization, were actually in a state of moral purity and innocence. And it's now a very well established stock character. And when you hear the phrase noble savage now, it's usually used in a skeptical or derogatory way to describe a kind of sentimental notion, every bit as simplistic and, you know, wrong as the original notion of violence and barbarity. But Rousseau took the idea quite seriously. Like Hobbes and Locke, he's a social contract thinker, and so he's seeking to describe the foundations of a just state on the basis of what human beings were like before the state came along. Man in a state of nature, for Rousseau, is independent and self sufficient, living harmoniously with nature. There's no ongoing communities of any sort, but no need for any such communities. For Hobbes, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, man was by nature selfish and corrupt, but this could be mitigated by the intervention of the state, by the intervention of a single sovereign. Rousseau believes that humanity is naturally good, not cooperative necessarily, no need for cooperation, but self-sufficient enough in his simple pleasures not to need any of this. He says, if I strip this being, thus constituted, of all the supernatural gifts which he may have received, and of all the artificial faculties which he could not have acquired but by slow degrees, if I consider him in a word such as must have been issued from the hands of nature, I see an animal less strong than some, and less active than others, but, upon the whole, the most advantageously organized of any. I see him satisfying the calls of hunger under the first oak, and those of thirst at the first river. I see him laying himself down to sleep at the foot of the same tree that afforded him his meal. And behold, this done, all his wants are completely supplied. It's society, for Rousseau, that corrupts us. Society makes us bad. Hobbes, for Rousseau, wasn't really talking, despite what he thought, he wasn't talking about natural man at all. He was talking about civilized man. He'd taken his view of human nature from his experience of civilized people and people in a state of war, the kind of wars that civilization actually produces. It was the outcome of civilization, not prior to civilization. And he took that conception of humanity and projected it back onto life before the state. This is what Rousseau believed. But man in a state of nature, for Rousseau, is not a mere animal. He is quite fundamentally distinct from the animal kingdom in that he has the ability to learn. He can gain, aside from his original nature and second nature, an acquired nature. Human beings, for Rousseau, were perfectible. Perfectible is a difficult word. I think perhaps the English word perfectible is a faux ami. It's not the best translation of the French perfectibilité. It really means not the ability to attain perfection, but the ability to improve, the ability to progress. This is what comes with freedom. He says, the faculty of self-improvement, by the help of circumstances, gradually develops all the rest of our faculties, and is inherent in the species as in the individual. A brute is, at the end of a few months, all he will ever be during his whole life, and his species, at the end of 1,000 years, exactly what it was the first year of that 1,000. But man, for Rousseau, isn't like this. He's free to develop himself. So we arrive at a slightly contradictory position where it's human nature to go beyond mere nature. Human nature involves change. And this is what is meant by our natural freedom. For Rousseau, it isn't simply the freedom to do what we want, but to be what we want. It's freedom to change. And now that can mean improvement, but it can also mean the opposite. It can mean our degradation and corruption. It can go both ways. one and the same faculty can produce both possible results. There's a potential corruptibility in our nature as much as a perfectibility. It's one and the same thing. So in fact, he doesn't really see us as basically good so much as basically free. And freedom means potentially virtuous or vicious.